This is Jim with Embervane, and by the end of this video, you'll know how to use a compressor to control dynamic range, and more importantly, how to be able to hear when you need to do it. In the previous video in this playlist, the concept of compression came up, how to hear it, and Crest Factor was one of those things that came into play. Well, we're going to spend some time today going over specific examples, including bass, piano, vocals, and drums, to hear Crest Factor. When you hear when a Crest Factor is high, you'll know when to be able to say, I might need to throw a compressor on there and control or limit the dynamic range. The origin of compressors started with limiting amplifiers. The whole purpose of compressors when they started was to control. And we gave great examples of that in the last video, but we're going to go over more today. Let's jump into the DAW. All right, the first thing we're going to do is start with the bass guitar. We have a bass guitar sample that I'm going to play through. I have a compression plugin that's here that is bypassed right now. And I have an in meter and I have an out meter. With these meters, we are going to be able to see what the crest factor is, compare what the different peaks are, and to speed things up, I've already matched loudness on these as far as perceived loudness goes, or LUFS integrated for the samples within normally 0.1 or 0.2 decibels. So we know that we're actually hearing the same perceived loudness. So let's start with bass guitar. Right off the bat, I'm going to play this little loop right here. And then I will toggle on the compressor after the fact. Sometimes this is not easy to hear, so don't worry. When we go through it, I'll try to point out the areas where it's like, hey, listen for this. So here we go. All right, that was a first time through raw, second time through with the compressor. Now you might not have heard a lot of difference on this. Why? Well, let's go through and look at those crest factor numbers one more time. I'm going to reset this guy and just start for a little bit here. All right, we're looking at about 4 decibels at that point. And you can see here that we have a peak max 10.9, a peak max of 7.44 or 7.4 rather. So with that, we've got about 3 decibels or so of difference. Now that's not tremendous. And yet at the same time, what should we be listening for? Remember, when we're listening for crest factor overall, we're trying to hear transientness, things poking at us, almost like pop, pop, like they're jabbing us in the face with sound. But this technically doesn't have that great of a crest factor. We're not talking about 30 decibels, for example. It was starting at like 14 or so, or 12. Well, we're only reducing it a little bit. So we know from the first video on how to hear compression that we're supposed to listen to that background stuff, the quieter things. So really quickly, we're going to go through this one more time, first raw and second on. Listen for the sound of the tone of the bass, because these high little parts that are coming in, those are technically peak moments. Those have been maintained, which means the rest of the sound has come up. Let's listen to it again, bypassing now. Start from the beginning. So it still sounds like a boom, ba da da da, boom, ba da da da. Like we still hear that kind of dynamic difference. It's technically less on the second one because it's raised up that body sound of the bass, that boom, da da da, boom, da da da. Whereas the first time when we listened through, that part was lower. So here's an example of using a compressor, and you can see on this needle about how much gain reduction we were getting in. It's not as critical right now. I wanted to show these examples so we can train to hear it and understand why we're using a leveling amplifier, limiting amplifier, a compressor to be able to control, more importantly than the settings, which we'll go to in a different video. But as you're watching this, you can see these sort of gain reduction movements here. They're not small. So I'm trying to push it a little bit again. Not that it's the perfect setting for this instrument, but so it's representative of what's going on. Here's the cool part, and I am going to reset these because they went to bypass. If we just play a little bit. All right, right off the bat, here's the key difference. We can see that we have about 3 decibels of extra headroom. And we took some of the tone of that bass and brought it up. That was raising the bottom part, the quieter stuff relative to the dee-dee-dee, higher pokey stuff, and created an overall, we'll call it more rounded or full bass tone. So that takes care of the bass guitar example that we've got right here. Let's go through and move over to the piano. Now, right off the bat, when you look at that waveform, you can see that we have some of these big moments happening. That is big transient, big vocal, or big total volume differences. And then there's this quiet stuff down here, you know? So in there, we should anticipate that there is a crest factor difference because we can literally see a big peak moment and smaller other moments. I'm going to close out the bass guitar meters. I'm going to open up the piano meters here. Once again, in and out. Let me reset them so they're clean. And I'm going to pull up a compressor. It's a different compressor. Don't worry about that part for right now. You can, if you want, see the gain reduction that's happening. The idea here was to select some compressors that tried to at least modify things and were better paired for instruments, but they're not, it's not a concrete kind of thing. So we have this guy now not on, and I'm going to play through just to hear it. I'm going to turn on the compressor after the first pass. I'll do the same thing, off, on, and then we'll go through and look at the actual crest factor numbers. Here we go. All right, now this one is a great example because of those big volume differences between the parts. Did it sound like when I turned the compressor on, it was louder? Kind of feels like that, right? Well, let's check the loudness on this one because we want to make sure we're not fooling ourselves and saying, oh, it's louder, so it could sound better or different. Let's go through with LUFS integrated here for loudness, and I'm going to leave the compressor on, so the top meter is before the compressor and the bottom meter is after. Looks like we are 0.2 decibels louder, and I would say that for the average person, you're not going to be able to hear that. However, if you were watching, you might have seen that there were times where these meters were not reading the same way. Well, part of that is because when we add a compressor, we're technically shaping or reshaping the envelope of the sound, and that can affect how we hear things. We know from the last video on how to hear compression that when we have something that is inherently an average loudness consistency that is higher, our brain pays more attention to it, and it feels like it is closer to us. This is technically what's happening inside of this piano experience. We are functionally the same total loudness, and yet the perception of it is one like, man, the piano feels like it's right there on me. And that is because we are bringing down some of these high guys and bringing up some of those low parts to be able to get this thing working through this compression process. So now let's go back and look at the crest factor here. Did we make any change with the crest factor, even though we can hear this sort of, let's call it tonal difference. Sure enough, look at that, 6 dB or so, ballpark. And remember, the crest factor can change over time because it's a time-based measurement, so we ignore the numbers afterwards. But what doesn't change is our peak value, -9 to about -12.5. So we're talking about, again, 3.5 decibels of extra headroom on this. Yes, there's some tonal changes because there were such different volume differences here, but this example is perfect for hearing. I'm going to bypass this again, for hearing when you need to use a compressor for control. Listen to those big higher notes just go pow, pow, right at you, while everything else is sort of back here. It's like somebody just jumped out all crazy style and then ducked back. And now compare that to our version with the compressor, which is squeeze things down just a little bit. We still have that transientness that's hitting. However, in relation to the rest of the sound, now it doesn't sound so different. Bam, and then all that quiet stuff. Bam, and then the twinkly stuff. Now it's kind of bringing things together. That's the dynamic range shrinking. That is the leveling of the dynamics, getting them closer and closer. Now we still have a pretty big crest factor when we look at this kind of thing. Play this just a little bit to measure it again. A 17 crest factor is not what I would consider controlled in a musical environment. And that gets us to a potential challenge that you'll have to work through. You may not be able to hit with one compressor or one tool enough control depending on how something is recorded. This one's coming in with some hot moments on it. And so depends on how it was mic'd, how it was played. It's really catching those peak moments. You might have to use some tools stacked together to basically shave off that crest factor and get it into a range that sounds musical. So what is something that's more musical? Well, kind of like that bass guitar that we had before after we added the compressor. It's like, all right, I'm feeling the groove of some volume differences, but the tone was there at the same time. This one would take some extra work, and we will touch on things like that in future videos. So that being done with the piano side, let's move on to drums. Drums inherently are spikier sounds automatically. You smack a drum, it's like bang, and then the volume kind of drops. Even if it were to resonate a little bit, the sound of the impact of the stick hitting the drum is always greater than that resonant sound which drops off like a tail. So let's get our meters up. Once again, in on the top, out on the bottom. And in this case, I'm going to use a different kind of compressor. This compressor it is set to the fastest attack possible. It is as good as an analog compressor can functionally get when it comes to speed. So I paired that on with something because drum hits are rising up very quickly. And that quick transient bump like this normally takes something fast to tame it. Let's see how this does. I am going to go off and on just like we did before. Listen for those pokey kind of moments on there. And then after a while, listen, when we get this thing dialed into where it's a better range, you can say like, okay, I understand where that musical crest factor is sitting. All right, we're taking off only about 3 decibels or something like that, so it's not a crazy amount on this thing. However, you'll notice the tonal difference in the sound here, and this goes back to that first video on how to hear compression. you hear the room, the background sound, the resonance of stuff is being brought up by the compressor. Well, that is part of the nature of compression here, right? That's just what we learned before when we did our drum hit, when it had this sound. Here it doesn't have a like the rustling of leaves. Here it has a sound like the room it was recorded in. Those tiny sounds are being brought up. So what did it do in terms of crest factor? Now, when you're listening to it, you might have said everything still sounded like it's kind of whacking pretty well here. So it wasn't like it just got smashed down. Let's check it out. And just to verify, we can do a quick volume check, or loudness rather, check on this. We're looking at integrated LUFS here, 1 pass through. All right, so we are again within 0.2. Technically, the compressor part is a little bit louder, at least off of a single pass. But again, that's 2/10 of a decibel here. That's close enough for what we are doing for sure. If I go back to the RMS side, we're going to check on the crest. Once again, using the handy DP Meter 5 by TB Pro Audio. Here is our crest factor comparison. You know, that really didn't show any difference in crest factor. And if we look at the peak max, this negative 0.87 compared to a negative 0.9, or negative 9 rather, we are really not moving the needle much at all. It's only about a half a decibel or so. And that is very different than the 4 decibels that we were getting in headroom with our other tests. So what the heck? What's going on? Well, this is one of the challenges that we run into with drums. When you have a drum hit, unlike the plucking of a guitar or the singing of a note, or even the plucking of a piano note, which tend to rise up, I'm going to exaggerate this, into a peak and then fall like this. Instead of that, when you have a drum hit, it goes up almost like a rocket and then kind of settles down like this. And the challenge here is that this compressor may not be able to react fully and engage before that big old spike comes in. It's just not fast enough. Even the fastest of compressors, when we are talking about analog or analog emulation compressors, we still have to run through circuitry. And even the super quick ones are going to miss part of that peak, which means that if you want to control the crest factor on drums, which are firing pretty quickly on average, then we're going to need to use a different tool. And in this case, I am going to turn off my compressor and I'm going to bring up a clipper. Now, what a clipper does is it technically limits or shaves off the very top of a waveform. And because it's not time dependent, it's basically acting like anything over the ceiling is like cut off, then we don't have to worry about a transient slipping through. Now, in this case, I've already preset this, and you can see that in the background, it was running and tracking things. And right here, anything in red is being shaved or clipped off. Now, I happen to have a little softer knee and maybe some saturation that's coming in, but I don't have it at a level that it should make a tremendous difference here. I am going to keep this thing on to start, and all we're going to do is watch the crest factor and compare what a clipper does, which again is ruthlessly crushing off the top of this, even causing small distortion aspects inside, compared to the compressor, which just couldn't quite react fast enough for all of those hits. Let's check out the measurements. Now we're seeing about 4 decibels. 4 decibels is very close to where we were on the bass and on the piano with the compressor. And yet with the drums, we need to bring in some help. This is one of the ways that you can control this better. Notice too, the peak max difference right here. We have about a 4.5-ish, right, decibels on the difference between the peak max on the in versus the out. So the clipper here is controlling it. Now I'm just going to do one more playthrough before we wrap up the drums. I want to play through on the control first, which is, let's shrink that crest factor. Even though it's still high, at 20 is still high, that would be probably one of your top end kind of transient moments there. But I want you to hear the difference between when we're doing it with the clipper and then when it comes off. And listen again for those extra pokes. There's a couple kick hits right in this area that tended to be pretty dynamic in the way this was recorded. Here we go. You can really hear it on those kick hits. When it's not having the clipper applied, they're just like, pow, like really coming out. Like, whoa, some of the mic was too hot, or like the percussionist was really hitting it. So there's an example of, on the drums, how to be able to say, all right, when is it more control and getting more toward musical? And remember, this crest factor item, it's not like you say, oh, I got to 20, I'm perfect, or I got to 14. You'll notice that the different instruments had different numbers of when they sounded less, let's say, dynamic, less percussive, lower crest factor, better in control. And you'll have to pay attention to that one. Things that are more transient, like a drum, if you squash those guys down and they had a 6 decibel crest factor range, like, it's going to be crushed. Whereas on a bass guitar, certain styles, that may actually be right on. Although it's typical that we'd probably find something in the 8, maybe, or 9 decibel range that was on there for those bass guitars. And up to, let's say, 20 is typically a very highly transient effect. If you were having a plucked acoustic guitar and you really wanted that thing to be plucked, like the plucks are coming out, it could be up to that 18 to 20 decibel range. Here on the drums, something else that would be very similar. So not all the time can we rely only on a compressor to get us where we want to go. That's why there's other tools available, but this is a great example on how to hear on the drums when we start to have some level of control. Let's move over to vocals. I have a vocal sample here, a short one, and here we're going to use a different compressor. This will be an LA2A, which is the similar style compressor that we used beforehand. This one's from a gem compressor from Overloud. And I'm going to go through first with it bypassed and then toggle it on the same way we did before. I want you to listen to elements where we would need control, right? Listen to volume differences as opposed to the leveling of stuff. Here we go.
I am walking through the forest. I am walking through the forest. I am walking through the forest. I am walking through the forest.
Oh, this one you can visually see, just like the last item, or the piano item, where I can see right here that this is big and these guys are pretty quiet. What would cause that? This vocalist may have, when she was singing it, simply been pulling away from the mic and then kind of leaned in on that forest part, but pulling in on the other words that were before it. And if we have a vocalist that doesn't have good distance control as they're singing when they're recording, that can happen. And that's part of the reason why you might use a compressor on a vocal to level things out, make those volume differences less noticeable, and yet at the same time still have an emotion of the vocal itself. Now, you may have said, hey, it did sound louder the second time through. Well, let's go and check it through. And by the second time, I mean with the compressor on. Here we are comparing compressor on the bottom to off on the top. Let's check our integrated LUFS.
I am walking through the forest.
Well, they end at almost the same spot. In fact, the compressed version is quieter. However, on some notes that were brought up, especially these quiet guys over here, they will be temporarily louder, but the big one, that forest one that cranks up the input on the non-compressed one, that one is actually being brought down on the compressed side, so we have a more even total experience. Let's verify that crest factor and hear what we're looking for. Remember, this example here was one that had, vocalist, again, probably leaned in on the mic or leaned back away from it at an odd spot. Maybe she's moving around when she's singing. Who knows? But that is one of the areas that's kind of an obvious spot for checking control. Here we go in Crest Factor.
I am walking through the forest.
You'll notice that the Crest Factor doesn't seem to be massively different. We're only, again, getting about a half a decibel on our peak max here sound. That's just a little bit of extra headroom. So even though we are leveling, there is still dynamics involved if we wanted to push it further, you could say, I want to push this thing even harder. The challenge is that if you did that right off the bat and just said, I want to crank it with one compressor, is that watch the gain reduction when we hit this area right here, which is big and intense. Watch the gain reduction here.
I am walking through the forest.
It went from 0 gain reduction on the through the, and then pegged at -7 dB like gain reduction on there. It's working hard on this. Now, you could, of course, gone through and edited the actual vocal and snipped it apart and done some clip gain automation or segmenting volume, right, adjustments there if you wanted to. If you didn't, you'd probably want to follow this compressor up with something else that could get the final version of how things are smoothed out. As we are seeing here that even with this one compressor, let's check the Crest Factor again.
I am walking through the forest.
Okay, so here we've got maybe a decibel or two, but we're still in that 18 range. And that 18 range is it's up there for a vocal. So this would be an example where you might need one to control and then another one to say, now I want to actually level it out more because I couldn't hit the whole thing on one without really just smashing it. And in general, these tools are going to be better used when they are not necessarily doing a massive amount of work to try to fix it in one shot. Don't be afraid to layer them up. In this case, if we were to make a copy of that same compressor. Now I'm running one into another in serial. So you're looking at the second LA2A here. This is what we get.
I am walking through the forest.
Let me just double check these numbers here again on the in and out. Try it again.
I am walking through the forest.
Crest factors here are, we've got a peak max issue, that's why. So let me adjust the loudness real fast here and just get I can ballpark it by ear.
I am walking through the forest.
All right, we're getting closer there. The second compressor would technically need different settings, and the gain setting being high is just pushing it actually louder than what we originally had. Let's check it now.
I am walking through the forest.
It's still probably pushing it a bit up because I haven't checked the actual loudness. And again, this is just kind of me slapping something on there to give you an example. But if we listen to the vocals themselves, it's like, okay, now you can hear this sense of a better control overall. Things are much, much more even. Would you do it exactly like this and just run one into another? Well, probably not the same compressor, and you probably play with the settings a little bit. So this was just an example to say, can we get some kind of changes? Remember, too, that hearing crest factor and measuring it are two different things. Crest factor is typically not measured over a long period of time. It's normally measured over a sharp difference between highs and lows. But if you can start to hear when we have higher crest factor, when these things are dancing, then you start to kind of intuitively know, hey, this is a good spot where I should put a compressor on to be able to control that dynamic range, to level that dynamic range, and a rough amount of gain reduction that might be necessary to do it. All right, that covers it for this video. If you got something out of it, drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you'd like me to break down next. Now go make some music. I'll see you in the next one.